Hello and welcome to another Lakers Theory podcast. This is your April 15th edition, which normally would mean that we are talking about the playoffs, but we are not because the Lakers season is finally, thankfully, mercifully over. The 2021-2022 campaign is in the books. The Lakers finished as the 11th seed in the West with a 33-49 record, and Austin Case and I are here to recap the entire season about what went wrong and what we got right, what we didn't, and basically just kind of vent our frustration about the season as a whole. But first, I wanted to kind of quick hitter start this podcast off with, if you had to sum up the season in one word, Austin, what would it be?
Disappointment.
Okay.
That's I feel like that's a common one, but I mean that's how I feel. I'm crazy disappointed. I foresaw the issues that we'll get into later, but not what it. The season was what I didn't want to expect. So I anticipated this outcome, but I tried to lie to myself and anyone that ever listened to this show, saying that I think it would be okay. And for moments we thought it could be. They never panned out, but I mean, just disappointment. That's the only way to sum it up in my mind.
Yeah, I think disappointment is a good word. I did like your point about how we kind of talked ourselves into this team, right? When Russell Westbrook initially announced the move was initially announced, we kind of were against it right away. And then we, as the season got closer, we kind of talked ourselves into it. It's like, hey, this is how it could work. I think the word I was settling on between two. I couldn't figure out if it was going to be disaster or pathetic. I think I'll go with disaster. I don't know. Even this was just as bad as it could get, right? This is like the F version of the season. Like if you were giving out a grade, they got an F this year. And if the Lakers had a C minus, they're in the playoffs. They lost 10 games to non-playoff teams. They went 1-3 against Minnesota, 0-4 against the Clippers, 0-3 against the Pelicans, and 2-2 against the Spurs. Those last four teams are all play-in teams. We were actually doing this podcast on play-in nights, fittingly, because the Lakers should be in this game. Like even the D plus C minus version of this team should be playing tonight, but they're not. And that's why I settled on disaster, because we got the F version of this team. Basically everything that could go wrong did. We can get into it all, kind of the nuts and bolts of what went wrong. But just our quick thoughts about it was just, it was pathetic. I mean, it was a disaster. It was disappointment. But let's kind of recap it. Just in general, what do you think went wrong? I mean, why do you think this team fell short?
I mean, you kind of hear all the things now that the season's over and people are fired. Well, just Frank Vogel's fired. So you kind of hear things where you can be like, okay, that I could understand why now that the team never clicked. But I mean, I don't think there was a lineup they could have put on the floor that was going to work. And I think that's it, because if you look back, it's just about every single night there's a complaint about a rotation or the lineup or something like this. And at some point you just have to think, was there a good lineup you could have put out there? I mean, you have to play guys. Like I feel like that's where Vogel was in coaching, where he had to play guys even if it wasn't for the better of the team. And that could not be true, but I feel like that's a safe thing to say. But I mean, I just don't think there was a good lineup that they could put on the floor that could really compete for a championship. And it sucks, but and we wanted to not believe that, but they just kind of proved to us, more often than not, that we probably were going to be disappointed.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the lineup thing. The 82nd game, so the final game, which was earlier this week, I think it was Sunday, They used their 41st different starting lineup. From start to finish, they had no idea what they were going to do with this roster. So, I mean, from top to bottom, everyone is to blame. The roster was constructed poorly. They didn't have a tall wing to save their life. They didn't have any length. They built a team around AD and LeBron. And when those two aren't healthy, or one of those two aren't healthy, they're kind of screwed, as we kind of saw last year, but it came into fruition again this year. And Russell Westbrook obviously did not pan out the way they expected to. I was saying before we even got on air, like if we had just gotten the Rockets version of Russell Westbrook from a couple years ago, I still think, that group could have been good enough. But Russell Westbrook declined in so many different ways. I just think from top to bottom, everyone is at fault. And that's where we'll go right here. I mean, who is the most to blame? If you had to sign one person, front office, player, coach, Austin Case, let's put your, kind of president hat on. Who are you assigning blame here? Who's the most to blame for this season?
I mean, I have to say it's whoever okayed the Russell Westbrook trade. They have to be held responsible. And I don't think it was Frank Vogel. I'll say that now. We can get into that later, but I don't think it was Frank Vogel's fault. But I have to say the Russell Westbrook trade. And I mean, I have to openly say I was against it before it even happened. But it's opportunity cost. Like the opportunities the Lakers couldn't get once they traded for Russ, and that was the killer. Not that KCP or Kuz or whoever they would have still had on their team had they not made that deal. I think that deal set them up to not be able to make the moves that they needed to make later on. So I mean that's where it started for me, and I felt that way the second it happened. I had a feeling that things just weren't going to go right because I was a hater. I was a Westbrook hater, but I mean, it was realistic things that we saw on the court that I didn't like about him being on this team. So I that's where it started for me. And that's about it.
I like that you went back to before the season and you said whoever okayed the trade, right? Because that was obviously the domino that had to fall for everything else to fall. Like your roster isn't as much of a bind if you don't make this trade, right? For a contract that is basically immovable, right? And you have to settle for all these veteran rosters. And that's what led to kind of the roster, because that was the first domino. And the person who may have okayed it may have been LeBron. It may have been Anthony Davis. It may have been a combination of two. We don't necessarily know. I assume they had a lot of say in the move, but we don't know for certain. And they're certainly trying to step back from it now. But I think you're right. It's whoever initially made this, because not only did you trade for a player that neither of us wanted and nobody seemed to believe in and had a bad contract, but you lost what made the championship squad from a couple of years ago so special, right? You lost some of that culture. Honestly, we said at the beginning of the season, if you had just run it back with last year's team, we felt pretty confident going into this year when the Western Conference was seemingly wide open, right? But when you made this move for Russell Westbrook, you shipped a lot of those guys, obviously. And I think you lost a lot of the kind of the culture and identity of what made this team great from a couple of years ago. A team that bought in defensively, a lot of role players who bought in to their specific, role on the team around LeBron James and Anthony Davis. Now, if neither of them are going to be healthy, the grand scheme of things, they would never have competed for another championship. But in terms of how pathetic and disastrous this season ended up being, it goes down to whoever decided that no matter what other moves there were, whoever decided let's trade for Russell Westbrook is the most to blame. Let's get into the Frank Vogel side of this. He was obviously let go because they had to blame someone, right? Someone has to be the scapegoat, and I don't think he's the first to go. I think there's gonna be other moves that they make, obviously.
Oh yeah,
but he is the easiest, right? Do you think this was the right move? Like, I think I don't want to put words in your mouth, right? But we both understood this was coming. Do you think this was the right move?
I don't. And it's because they're essentially saying, we gave you this roster, you couldn't do anything with it, so that's your fault. And it's just not fair. Like I understand, like, he played DJ or he started DJ for too many games or whatever. Okay, well, he was using what you guys gave him. It was the beginning of the season. Like he's trying to say, how can I make this team work? And it didn't work. So I disagree with it. And I know there were some lineup problems where a lot of people disagreed with and stuff like that. But what's he supposed to do? He's using the guys he has on his roster. So I don't like it. You rebuild this roster in the off season. You get guys that can commit on the defensive end, and I think that was lacking this year. And I don't think that was a coaching issue. I just think it was a mentality issue. But all they would have to have done this offseason is rebuild the roster with guys who are going to commit to that side of the ball, who are, Frank could coach. So I don't know. I disagree with it. I've low-key been kind of looking forward to being able to say I disagree with it, but I feel like he was used as the scapegoat, and it was undeserving.
This is interesting because I do get what you're saying, but I do think this is going to be the first time we disagree on the show, and maybe the only time on this podcast. But I do think Frank Vogel deserved to be let go. I kind of voiced my frustration with him throughout the year. I mean, this goes back to early season podcast. But even if you look at kind of that championship team, right? You mentioned the defense, and yeah, he is good on that end of the floor, right? But it's a lot of like on the offensive end, they're running ISOs, they're running a lot of balls through Anthony Davis and LeBron James specific, and you don't get a whole lot of sets that way. And I've always was frustrated with that kind of aspect. It felt like the offense was uninspiring, and I understand that sometimes personnel dictates that, right? But I do think he deserves some criticism for how he utilized, DeAndre Jordan, Avery Bradley, Rajon Rondo, Trevor Ariza. Like all those guys had two prominent roles for the level of production they were providing for this team. And I think it took him far too long to adjust. I think what you saw, and I agree, the roster was not set up for him, right? I mean, they failed him by setting this roster for him. And honestly, they set him up to be kind of the scapegoat in a way with that extension. But I just think that you saw that he couldn't adjust to a thing, to a roster that didn't suit him or his skill set.
Yeah.
And maybe that's a communication issue between him and the front office. I don't know what it is, but I just think that I would have let him go. I don't think he is the biggest, we already said it. I don't think he's the most to blame for this season. I don't even think he's one of the top reasons to blame for this season. But I don't think he's blameless. And I think he's the easiest one to move this offseason, to at least start the offseason. And so to me, it was a no-brainer. I was a little disappointed that it was released right at the buzzer of the final game. But that's just Woj being Woj. Probably had less to do with the Lakers. So, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I would have liked for him to had one more season. Like a championship less than 2 calendar years ago. Like that earns you one more year after a disaster season. So and that's kind of what hits me the most is it's like the championship he won means nothing compared to one bad season. So I think that's the biggest thing to me.
Let's get into the Russell Westbrook side of this because that is the most juicy part of this podcast, especially from the Austin standpoint. I put this in here in this section of the podcast because, I used the exit interviews. Like I watched all the exit interviews a couple days ago. I thought that was really entertaining. Russell Westbrook was the first one I watched because I wanted to see what he was going to say. And he's always entertaining in his own way. But he accepts that it was a down year by his standards. That was one of the first questions asked to him. He did not, however, accept responsibility for anything. It was a lot of Frank Vogel's fault. It was a lot of even LeBron and Anthony Davis's fault, and not Russell Westbrook's fault. A lot of fans too, even the Westbrook and the hate that he got all over the year, he kind of attributed that to as well. So already Lakers fans were frustrated with Russell Westbrook in the year that he had and how this all turned out. But they are especially frustrated after his exit interview if they watched any of that kind of 20-minute fun. Let's get into it. What was your kind of takeaway from kind of Russell Westbrook's comments to close out the year?
I'm not surprised. I mean, I don't. How could it not be his fault to miss open layups and fucking shooting shots off the back of the backboard from the front? Just ridiculous things like that. How's that anyone's fault? I mean, I can understand if there's pressure from LeBron and Anthony Davis to kind of play at your peak 24/7. I could understand that if they're asking him to do more than what he's comfortable with and it's just not working. I don't know. I think he said something like he felt like he had to prove himself to Vogel just all the time. I mean, I don't understand that because he started every game essentially. So I don't know. I find it crazy that he doesn't take some responsibility for being terrible. I don't know. I can't wait for the booze to rain down on him the next time he's in Staples Center. That's for sure. Sorry, Crypto.com arena.
What?
I look forward to that, but it's just these are things that I have disliked about him before he became a Laker. So I'm not surprised that he did these things. But it's just kind of, I hate that he had to do this stuff as a Laker. And, I low-key blame him for the year, but I know it's more than that, but I think for me, it started on that day. So,
yeah. Well, silly me, because part of me, what talked myself into this group, right, was I thought Russ agreeing, right, to come to this situation meant that he understood that he was going to sacrifice a little bit, right? You're going to have to see a little bit less of what made Russ in order for the greater good, right? To play alongside of LeBron and AD and go win a chip, right? Instead, he was like pretty vocal right away that, oh no, I'm the point guard, right? Like I'm not, defaulting to a smaller role. And like, this is what you all, when you're trying to build a big three, right? Like some superstar is going to get let out. Like he's cut out. He's going to have to reduce to a smaller role. The interesting thing about all of this is Russ actually didn't have a lesser role with the Lakers. A lot of it was injury related, right? But he was still second on this team in usage. Only 5 players in the NBA brought the ball up the court more than Russell Westbrook. So he was the point guard. The Lakers literally just gave him the ball and said, bring the ball up the court. What he wasn't was efficient. He led all NBA players with 233 missed shots in the restricted area. He was bad. He missed a lot of wide open threes. He missed 189 of them, actually. Like, he was second in the league in turnovers. Like, he had a high usage. He just was bad statistically, production wise. He wasn't efficient. He had bad numbers, and so credit to him for admitting like this was a down year for him. But it was not because he had a smaller role. If anything, he had a bigger role than I envisioned, or probably the Lakers envisioned, and he didn't answer to it. Right? Like this was a down year for him. Like, he declined in a lot of key areas. He was already a guy who brought something in specific areas to the game, right? Even if you were the biggest Russ hater in the world, like, he had strengths that you could not deny. And he lost all of that this year, like completely. And it was not fun to watch. I honestly remember like 1 or 2 moments being excited about something he did on the floor. So no, this is Russell Westbrook has only himself to blame. I understand that, he probably, got defensive at times towards the end of the year, right? When all these fans are kind of booing him, when he's getting the criticism and press that he's getting, he's going to get defensive, but like, he only has himself to blame for what he did on the court himself this year. Now, he's not the biggest, he's not the most to blame, or like the number one only blame for the Lakers season, but he's the number one blame for what he did on the court, because he was bad. And silly me for believing that he could be anything else. And there's a realistic possibility that he could be back, right? Like,
yeah,
it's going to be hard to move him. And we have to accept the reality that there's a chance that the Lakers just decide, hey, we have to come back. And the Lakers were 11-10 when all three of their guys played: Anthony Davis, LeBron James, and Russell Westbrook. That equates to a 43-win season. You're talking about a team that's probably a 7 seed, 7 or 8 seed, 6 seed, somewhere around that range. So you're talking about a team that could be in the playoffs at that record, right? They just fell short of that in basically every other sample size. So I don't know. I don't want to. I don't know. I'm just so disappointed in the season that he had that I'm hoping, praying that he does not come back. But I'm also accepting the reality that there's a tiny % chance that he does.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I would be upset if he came back, because I think that that takes away other opportunities for them to bring different guys in. But I mean, what would you say? They were 10-11 or 11-10?
11-10.
Oh, see, I mean, that's 21 games together.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you take that. I mean, if they get 60 games together, we're having a different conversation, because they're probably in the playoffs right now. So injuries play a role in this season too. So I have to think about that. But if they had to bring him back next year, I'd be disappointed. But I would say, let's get a good season where guys stay healthy. At least LeBron and AD can stay healthy and stuff like that. Like, let's get all three of these guys on the floor as much as possible, not 21 games. So, but I mean, you can't trade him and get rid of some good draft capital for 7 years in the future.
Yeah.
And you can't waive him and stretch $47 million. Like, those are just the two things that I would keep him on this team before I do that. So, I guess I'm not 100% against him returning, but I would love to see what they could do to not bring him back.
Yeah. You mentioned health. AD and LeBron have missed 131 games over the past 2 years. They had a minus 2.5 point differential when they were on the floor together this year. So if you compare that to last year when they were together and the year before, they were much better. So, the source of how the Lakers get better, right, is those two. Like, if the Lakers can get back to being really good when they're on the floor together and they're healthy, which is a big if, both are big ifs, honestly, like that is one way of getting back. And the rest you'll figure out later. But like, as long as you have those two playing at the level that we have seen them recently capable of, you can start to find your way into a better picture next year. I guess looking ahead, because we already started to do that a little bit.
Yeah.
This has been a 20 plus minutes of just kind of honestly sad podcast talk about a really pathetic season. Is there any reason for optimism next year?
I mean, yeah, there's going to be a completely new roster again. So there's that aspect. We're going to get a lot of off-season action. So we'll have we'll probably have a lot to talk about over the off-season. I mean, I'm really looking forward to see what happens with Malik Monk. I think it'll be a massive mistake if he's not in the Lakers jersey again next year. At least it'll be a massive mistake by the Lakers if he's not in one of their jerseys. I look forward to that. Honestly, I look forward to see what happens with Russ. I know I've sent you tons of trade scenarios, some that I just like made up, and then a couple days later I started seeing that stuff on Twitter, and I was like, this can't be happening. But I think there's a lot to look forward to this offseason if they do smart basketball moves. This could go downhill very quickly and very early, depending on what they do. But I'm hoping it's smart basketball decisions.
That is a big if. It probably starts with the coach. Any strong takes on who the next coach is, or do you not have an opinion on that?
I have no idea. Yeah. And honestly, I was thinking, why couldn't you build a roster and then find a coach that can coach that roster instead of, just bringing a coach in and saying, all right, we're going to go get all these guys for you. Let's see
Mhm.
what you can do.
Yeah.
I know that's not how things work, but that's
Mhm.
just my personal thought. But yeah, I see names flying around and I'm just like, I have no idea.
Yeah.
There's like 4 guys on the roster right now. I don't think I'm really not worried about who's going to coach them next year until we can put 5 guys on a court if we needed to.
Yeah. Well, as long as 2 of those guys are Anthony Davis and LeBron
Yeah.
James, you'll probably get some good candidates.
Mhm.
And we got a whole offseason. This is a much earlier offseason, so I'm sure we'll be back to talk about other things as the offseason happens, like more news happens. We'll probably hop on and talk a little bit. Honestly, it'll be more interesting than anything that happened this past year. So maybe it'll be more frequent than this past year as well. Before we close this one out, the playoffs are about to, the last play-in game is happening as we pod. So that means the playoffs start tomorrow. I don't even remember what our playoff predictions were at the beginning of the year, so let's just assume they were wrong. Redo. What is your finals prediction? And are you even, first of all, are you even looking forward to watching the playoffs? And then tell me your finals prediction.
I honestly, I probably won't watch a minute of the playoffs. But I have to see who's in it. The second I knew the Lakers were terrible and probably not going to make it, I kind of disconnected from everything NBA. I kept up with the Lakers, obviously, but as for the NBA in total, I had no idea what was going on.
I'll probably be lame and just pick. I am looking forward to the playoffs a little bit, right? I think it'll be interesting. It'll be competitive. The Nets Celtics series right here in round 1 is be amazing. But I'll be lame and just say a repeat of last year's finals because Giannis is amazing, and I'm going to keep rooting for Giannis to do amazing things. And I do think the Suns. The Western Conference is really theirs to lose, right? It was going to be that way no matter who was in the playoffs. And so I'll say Bucks and Suns, and maybe the Suns get the revenge this time. So Suns over Bucks is my prediction. As a person who bet on the Mavs to win the Western Conference like a month ago, Luka being out within the last week is really a big bummer. He got injured in the regular season finale, and nobody knows if he's coming back. So really concerned about that. Austin, did I ad lib long enough for you to come up with a fake finals prediction that we're definitely going to hold you accountable to?
Okay, so here's my take. I'm taking Chicago and Golden State.
Okay.
Sleepers.
If he gets one of those right, I will never hear the end of it. That's for sure. That is a very interesting pick and one that, I think basketball fans would enjoy seeing. So those are both pretty strong fan bases. So the ratings will probably be pretty high, but I'm guessing not. He picked a very unlikely outcome and I picked the most basic outcome. So we'll see who's right. And we'll see if the Lakers can get right in the offseason. He's Austin Case. I'm Shane Jackson. Thank you so much for listening to a Lakers Theory podcast and see you next time.